Hey guys, it's Kenna here. Today's lecture, we're going to be looking at what is a species and the process of speciation. Now, I know we've had you try and answer this question before, and hopefully you recognize that it was a lot harder than you thought it was to go ahead and define the term species. So today we're going to look at that problem. We're going to talk about developing a working definition that we can hopefully use when we say the term species, and then talk about how one species becomes multiple species. Okay. So here are our essential questions for the day. Number one, what is a species? Okay, you might try going ahead and pausing here and seeing if you can go ahead and come up with a definition, and then we'll talk about changing that as we give you some other examples of definitions that have been used historically. Two, what is the problem with defining? When you did this the first time, as we go through this today, hopefully you recognize that there are problems. So there are some really cut and define differences that you can see between certain species, like starting to look at a plant versus an animal. But when you start getting to specific species, sometimes that line is much more difficult to draw between one animal and another related animal. Okay, number three, what is the process of adaptive radiation and how does that relate to speciation? In the previous week, we talked about modes of natural selection and reproductive isolation. So if you have separate gene pools, how does that force a change in a particular species or the creation of multiple species um, through this change in the gene pool content? Okay. In other words, how do environmental pressures lead to changes in the organism's gene pool? And then lastly, how fast does this process of speciation take place? So let's start with what is a species? Can you answer this? If I were to ask you to define species right now, could you give me a very concrete definition for it? Probably the answer is no. Okay, so in this particular slide, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to pause frequently and come up with a good answer, and then go ahead and unpause it and move on. Okay, so while that particular definition is in your mind, whatever you've come up with now for what a species is, let's apply that definition to a couple of examples of pairs of organisms. So first of all, are an oak tree and a dog the same species? Okay, go ahead and pause the video, think about it, and decide yes or no. Okay, hopefully you've got an answer to that question. Now let's move on to the next one. Are a dog and a cat the same species? Okay, again, think about your definition and decide yes or no. Okay, now hopefully you have an answer to that. And let's move on to the next question. Are a dog and a wolf the same species? So think about that question. Pause the video here. And once you're ready to go ahead and move on, then we'll go ahead and talk about it. Okay, so are a Labrador Retriever and a Golden Retriever the same species? So again, go ahead and pause the video here and try and answer this question. Okay, so hopefully you've got an answer to each one of these is yes or no. Now when we go ahead and start here, we can look at an oak tree and we go ahead and look at the dog. Hopefully we recognize as we do this, this is an animal, okay, and that this one over here is a plant. These are noticeable differences. Animals tend to go ahead and breathe in a more traditional fashion. They have the similar type of organs like we've been discussing in terms of lungs, brains, these types of things, where an oak tree is a plant. So these are quite different. And so hopefully you recognize at this point that no, these two are not the same species. Then we move on to a dog and a cat, the same species. So now in this case, we've got both organisms being animals. Are they the same species? I don't know what you guys said, but hopefully you got to the answer of no. So when we go ahead and start looking at these, they are both animals, but that's just their kingdom, and we'll talk more about kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species, the taxonomic hierarchy later on when we get to classification. But this is a feline, and this is a canine. And so that distinction has some pretty particular terminology related to its physical structure and its need for meat consumption. Okay. All right, let's move on to the next one. Are a dog and a wolf the same species? This one's a little harder to do than the other ones that we've done before. Some of you may have said in this particular case that a dog and a wolf, which are both canines, are the same species. But most scientists today would actually say that no, they are not the same species. Okay, so when we look at the dog, we're looking at Canis domesticus. When we look at the wolf, we're looking at Canis lupus, Canis arctos, these types of organisms. So while they are the same genus and they're very closely related, they are not actually recognized as the same species. Now we can go ahead and take a look at the Labrador Retriever and the Golden Retriever. And so this is the only place where we currently would say yes, these two are part of the same species. But even if you said no to all of these, there's definitely some underlying pieces where you could very well be correct when you go ahead and say this. So let's go ahead and start looking at how we define a species, and then we'll go ahead and move on to go ahead and looking at some examples. Okay. All right. So when you define a species, um, hopefully you're recognizing that there is a big debate among biologists about how to exactly define species. And we actually identify this as something known as the species problem. Now, most textbooks, most biology textbooks and other science textbooks will use some definition similar to that given by Ernst Mayr. Now, Ernst Mayer's definition of a species says that they are groups of actually or potentially interbreeding natural populations which are reproductively isolated from other such groups. So a key piece of this that I would like to highlight is this idea of reproductively isolated. Okay, we talked about this last class when we were going to go ahead and take a look at modes of natural selection and how those environmental pressures impact the gene pool of a particular species. Okay, so when we go ahead and take a look at this, reproductive isolation is a key piece here. This is not a problem that's new. I think many people think of this as a current problem in science, but this is something that was recognized even by Darwin when he published On the Origin of Species. In chapter 2 of that book, he says, no one definition has satisfied all naturalists. Yet every naturalist knows vaguely what he means when he speaks of a species. Just like when you and I talk, you probably had some idea of what you thought a species was, even if you couldn't actually come up with a definition. But it turns out that defining it is much harder than just using the word itself. Okay? One of the more common historical definitions, and we run into problems with this today, is this idea of a species being a population or group of populations that differ morphologically from other populations. Now, this term morphologically simply means based on their physical shape. And you'll see that back in the day when Darwin was originally doing his work, most of the species were differentiated based on how they physically appeared, what they looked like. And we now know that that can be a tricky piece of genetic history, looking at evolution, is that some species that look very similar are actually unrelated, and some species that look very different can actually be related. Okay, and this was justified back in the day by using an example like this. We can distinguish between a chicken and a duck because they have different shaped bills and the duck has webbed feet. Based on physical characteristic differences, we can identify that a duck is not a chicken. But species being defined this way is not recognized as the most accurate representation of separation of species, even though it was used this way since the beginning of recorded history. Today, we use a lot more genetic information, and we start looking at how similar their genetics is, where they're found, as well as morphological differences that exist between closely related populations. So, most species have been described historically by the morphology model, and we still use this in many instances, especially if we don't have good, reliable genetic information to compare with. Okay? Here's the working definition that I would like you to use, and I gave this to you in your speciation. I'll give this to you again in your speciation video, which you'll watch after this on Edpuzzle. Okay? A species is a class composed of related individuals that resemble one another, so physical traits, are able to breed among themselves, but are not able to breed with members of another species and produce fertile offspring. They have some common characteristics or qualities, both morphologically and or genetically. Now, I know that's a mouthful, and in normal cases, we wouldn't go to such great lengths to define a single word. But here I think it's important because it lies at the heart of our description of evolution and this idea of changing from one species to another species or one species to multiple species. Okay? But you should also recognize that there are problems with this type of defining. Using a typical textbook definition, this works pretty well for multicellular organisms, but there are several types of situations where this breaks down. Okay? One, by definition, it only applies to organisms that reproduce sexually. So it doesn't work for asexually reproducing organisms. You think of something like this. You think of some sort of protozoan or some sort of single-celled animal, and they reproduce asexually. And because of this, the previous definition of being able to interbreed is unimportant because one separates into two and so on and so forth. So this idea of evolution by having sex is not recognized for these particular type of organisms. Another problem that we start running into is that biologists frequently do not know whether two morphologically similar groups of organisms are potentially capable of interbreeding. An example I would give you is the black and the white rhino. Now, there have been cases in the wild where the black and white rhino have mated and produced fertile offspring. Although if you look at the structure of the snout of the two different rhinos, they are physically quite different. And in fact, when we start looking at extinction and looking at the loss of one of these rhino species, one of the suggestions was to breed the two together to go ahead and get some new offspring. Is that still the same species? Can you have black rhino and white rhino? And the answer is, I'm not sure we know, because there is not a distinct line between the black rhino and white rhino in terms of their ability to reproductively isolate. Okay? So only really applies to those that reproduce sexually, and this idea of potentially capable of interbreeding is a slippery slope. All right, two more problems with defining. There is a considerable variation in the degree to which hybridization may succeed under natural conditions. Now, in zoos, we've actually seen some of this happen. Many of you may have seen Napoleon Dynamite when you start talking about ligers and tigons. These organisms actually do exist. Now, in most cases, these are infertile, and so they're sterile and do not produce offspring of their own, thus making them not a true species. But this becomes tricky too, because in the wild, you'll also see things like mules. Mules cannot reproduce, they're sterile. But you will see mules made by crossing deer and donkeys and horses in the wild. So how much of this is acceptable? We still consider them a living thing, but we don't consider them a species. So what are they? So ligers, tigons, these types of things get a little tricky. And then lastly, we have a few cases where it may be physically impossible for animals that are members of the same species to mate. Great example of this is our discussion we had before with dogs. Now, in these cases, human intervention has caused these massive morphological differences in the physical structures of the organisms. But in terms of what we see, we typically tend to exclude them from the biological species concept because they are not naturally occurring, but humans have forced these changes upon them. This would be a great example. Regardless of which of these particular dogs ends up being the male or the female, this becomes problematic in terms of the idea of being able to interbreed. So their gene pools, if left in the wild, would not intermingle, and therefore these two organisms would be on their way to becoming separate species. Okay. So an example of a species that has a huge amount of diversity in it is the honey creeper. Now, if you were to go to the Hawaiian Islands, you'll see that there are a huge variety of different types of birds that are all part of the same quote unquote species. And there's been a big discussion about whether they should be one species or whether they should be multiple species. And if you take a look at their beak shape, their coloration, the tufts, etc., they look quite varied. But genetically speaking, they have very similar ancestry, and their DNA is very, very similar with a lot of variation built in. So how do we decide whether or not that honey creeper is a single species or multiple subspecies or even multiple species themselves? And I didn't want to leave you with this kind of creepy stuffed dead bird page. And so here are some more honey creepers, again, just highlighting the amount of variation that exists among these birds. Okay. All right. So let's move on to the concept of adaptive radiation. Now, if we're going to think about a species like the honey creeper, where there's so much diversity, what if some event came into play and they got separated, put in different environments, and then they have to adapt to those environments? And you see natural selection working on those different groups depending on their particular environment and the gene pool that they have. This is similar in some respects to the genetic drift that we talked about before, but in this particular instance, we're just looking at selective pressures of the environment in different areas of the native range for a species. So adaptive radiation is the process by which one species evolves into several. It is not an end point, and therefore it is the process or journey itself. And a great example of this is the divergence of species of salamanders as they move south in California. It's a version of this form picta here, and so we're going to take a look at this salamander population. Now, these are native to southern Oregon and northern California. From here, you see that the species is going to move in two directions. We're going to have one group of those salamanders that's going to go through the Sierra Nevada mountains, and one group of these salamanders that's going to go along the Coast Range. Their adaptation to their environment is a great example of adaptive radiation as they start looking at speciation. Now, I have a video for you to go ahead and watch here. It's a little grainy, but it's the best I could get from the professor, so please enjoy this, and then we'll go ahead and pick up from there.
Meet a type of terrestrial salamander found in California. Now meet another, and another. These salamanders are members of the same species, so why do they look and behave so differently? In California, populations of these salamanders became separated geographically, evolving over millions of years to adapt to different environments. They've changed so much that they are on their way to becoming entirely separate species. David Wake of the University of California, Berkeley explains.
The history of this species complex began about 10 million years ago in the ancient redwood forests of northern California, where we have today this form picta, which is highly variable both genetically and in terms of coloration. There were two migratory routes followed by animals as they moved into southern California. One along the Sierra Nevada mountain chain, where animals moved into the forested region. The other along the coastal mountains. They avoided the Great Central Valley.
The populations that gradually moved down the forested region of California relied on blending in with their environment. Animals with good camouflage tended to survive more and produce offspring with similar traits. As the salamanders progressed south over millions of years, the markings became more distinct.
At the end of the chain in Southern California, we have this form ploveri, which is the extreme of variation, showing the largest blotches, most bold marking. These were all then camouflaged organisms that were hiding from predators. Along the coast, a different strategy was followed. Here, the organisms adopted the color pattern and behavior of dangerously poisonous newts, and they became, instead of camouflage, they were advertising their resemblance to these dangerously poisonous animals and gaining an advantage because of their mimicry. So what happened is that you had two differently adapted lineages moving to the south, and by the time they reached the southern end, they had essentially evolved into different species. But at certain areas, for example, in the Palomar Mountain area in San Diego County, we get these animals which are hybrids, and the hybrids are neither similar to the dangerously poisonous animals, they're not good mimics, nor are they good animals in terms of camouflage. So these organisms are essentially dead ends.
These hybrid offspring are not well adapted to their environment and are therefore less likely to survive. The two parent subspecies that produce the hybrids are well on their way to becoming entirely separate species, evolving just as Darwin described in his theory of evolution.
I think Darwin would love this example because it shows exactly the sorts of patterns that he was talking about. Gradual adaptive divergence, leading eventually to the establishment of new species.
Okay, so as you can see here, we see this two separate groups of the salamander moving along different migratory paths as they head towards Southern California. One group going through the Sierra Nevada, relying on camouflage. One growing through the Coast Range, relying on mimicry. Because their gene pools are isolated, they begin to separate and diverge. And because of that, by the time you get to the bottom of the Central Valley, which is really too dry, you can see this area right here for any salamanders to exist. In these small areas where there is some overlap, you begin to realize that when they do interbreed, the hybrids are not successful in terms of their ability to go ahead and survive. So reproductive isolation has produced essentially two separate gene pools, and in those areas where you have overbreeding, the unsuitability of the hybrid is leading towards speciation, and this is what adaptive radiation is. And here you go again, is that particular pattern, all these different salamanders. Okay, this is the area where the first one is thought to have evolved in southern Oregon and northern California. You see this Oregonensis version that comes up into Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia in this northern region. And then you start seeing the change in the patterning as they go along the Sierra Nevada mountains, as they come through here and start going through the coastal range before they get into southern California. So what you're really seeing here is the process of speciation. And put very simply, speciation is the formation of a new species or species, more than one if it's divergent evolution or diversifying selection. Okay. Now, just because two things look similar, though, I want you to realize that that doesn't guarantee that they're related to each other. There is something called convergent evolution, where individuals develop similar traits because those traits are really good for the job that organism does. It doesn't mean that they're related, but it means that they have similar role in their ecosystem, and because of that, they tend to develop similar physical characteristics. In this particular example, you can see here the giant armadillo, giant pangolin, spiny anteater or echidna, and the giant anteater all have these long, thin snouts and really long tongues. That's because they primarily eat insects and a lot of ants. Okay, if you look at the front paws, you've got these like sharp claws. These are primarily for digging. So if you're going to go into an anthill or rip open a log to get some termites, that's a really helpful tool. So their physical structures are not based on evolutionary history in this case, but are based on the jobs that they have within their ecosystems. However, in other instances, you will see two species that are so closely reliant on each other that they evolve together. Okay? An example of this comes in the form of the Darwin sphinx moth and the orchid that Darwin discovered. It was a long time before this particular sphinx moth was ever discovered. Okay? The moth was identified by Darwin, and because it had a really long nectary tube, You can see down here at the bottom, Darwin predicted the existence of this moth long before it was ever discovered. Now this is really clumsy. So what this particular sphinx moth does is it kind of rolls up its proboscis like a fire hose, and then it unrolls it when it's going to go ahead and get nectar from the actual orchid. Now these two organisms are going to evolve together. So as the pollen tube changes in terms of length, you have to have something to pollinate it. And if there wasn't that species to do it, the other one would die off. We have an example of this with the Kincaid's lupin here in Oregon. The flower and the insect that pollinate it are both highly reliant on the other for their successful reproduction and survival. And so in many pollinator and pollinated systems or seed dispersal, there are some great examples of this. Think of any symbiotic relationships and you'll see coevolution occurring frequently. All right, so the last thing I want to leave you with today before you go on to your assignment is this idea of how fast does this all take place? Well, obviously this depends on the lifespan of the species. The shorter the lifespan, the faster evolution is going to take place because it has to go through many, many generations. But in terms of actual geologic history, how quickly has this happened? And this is actually a place where scientists tend to disagree. Some scientists believe that this is a very, very slow, steady process that they're going to call gradualism. In other instances, there are scientists who believe that very little change happens for many, many years, and then all of a sudden, some sort of major event occurs in the environment and forces fairly rapid evolution. So it comes in these little bursts. The first one is what we call gradualism, where organisms change slowly over time at a very steady rate. And the other is punctuated equilibrium, where there are long periods of time with no change, followed by very short periods of rapid evolution. Go ahead and pause the video here and think about which you think is correct. Now, before you make your final answer, I do want to point out one thing. When we say quick for punctuated equilibrium, this doesn't assume quick as in like immediately. When this talks about quickly, it's talking about over hundreds of thousands of generations still, and through an extensive series of intermediate stages. But in terms of geologic time, it's so few in terms of couple thousand years, that it may appear to be a small moment relative to the millions of years of existence for most species. So rates of evolution vary enormously, and new species may seem to rise suddenly in geologic time, even though the time involved would seem long if you were actually alive to witness it, especially compared to a human lifetime, which is typically considered to be about 80 years. So here are representations of both of these types of evolutionary timelines. The one on the left is gradualism, where you have these slow, steady changes, but it's always changing a little bit. And then on the right, you have punctuated equilibrium. And I hope when you think about this, you realize that while there tend to be these two extreme camps, there are some scientists as well that think, well, there's probably some of both, depending on the environment, depending on the particular species that you're dealing with. All right, so that's our information for today. I hope you guys are doing well. I'll talk to you again soon. Take care of yourselves. We'll see you on the flip side. So long.